All right, sitting here in Western PA, yard work going on. Maybe there'll be a train whistle from a railroad, but that's okay. Lady Madonna, children at your feet, wonder how you manage to make ends meet. Who finds the money when you pay the rent? Did you think that money was heaven sent? Friday night arrives without a suitcase, Sunday morning creeping like a nun. Monday's child does learn to tie his bootlace. See how they run. Lady Madonna, baby at your breast, wonder how you manage to feed the rest. Okay, well, there's a snippet of a song, so let's have a story. The Beatles. I had to choose the Beatles, right? I was born in June of 1964. That was the summer of Beatlemania. This song in particular, Lady Madonna. Wow, the lyrics. Talk about evoking my childhood. Who finds the money when you pay the rent? Wonder how you manage to feed the rest. Well, that's it. I had two Lady Madonnas in my childhood, and one was my grandmother, the other one was my mom, of course. They really kept it together for us. Now, I've explained previously, my father, George Duran, dude with a heart of gold, but wild, and loved to rev his motorcycle around Poughkeepsie and Hyde Park, and he's all 24 years old. I was just a few months old when he passed away, got in a car accident or motorcycle accident out on Route 9G in Hyde Park about 3 o'clock in the morning. When I was not even 2 years old, my maternal grandfather, my grandmother Connie's husband, Anthony Trena, he passed away of a heart attack. So mid-60s, my mom, sitting there with 4 kids. I was her fourth at 23 years old. She had her first at 17. And, you know, this song really, you know, with having to deal with how do you feed the kids? How do you keep a roof over your head? That was my grandmother and my mom on 185 Mill Street in Poughkeepsie. Now, my great-grandfather Corrado, my grandmother's father, he was still alive for the first 10 years of my life. I'm blessed that I was able to know him, but he was very elderly. So I want to talk about how my grandmother and my mom managed to keep things together. I'll talk first about my grandmother. Now, she was always an energetic lady. Just all of maybe just about 5 feet tall, but she loved to be around, out and about. She loved people. She loved talking to people. She could talk to anyone. Well, my mom remarried in 1967. So we had a stepfather, not a great dude. I'm not going to talk about him too much. But we found an apartment around the corner from Mill Street, and we lived at Duane Street for a couple years. Then we moved up to Hyde Park into a development called Bradley Village. I'll talk more about that. But we would still be dropped off on weekends as older children to spend the weekend with my grandmother and my great-grandfather. So on a Saturday, my grandmother loved to take us up to Main Street, and she would do her shopping, she would do her errands, and we would get to experience a little bit of, you know, city life, because now we were in Hyde Park, really rural area. The stores she liked to visit depended. I mean, she did her practical shopping at the dime stores. There was one called Kresge's, which later became Kmart, and then the other one was Woolworths. Now, today we have dollar stores that don't even sell things for $1 anymore. Back then it was dime stores. It just goes to show you just how much inflation, you know, has affected everything. There were also 2 department stores that were upscale. One was called Wallace's and the other one was Lucky Platt's. And whenever we went into those, it was basically so my grandmother could do a little window shopping. But they reminded me of the city-type department stores you'd see in movies, like Miracle on 34th Street or something like that. In any case, we did our practical shopping, or my grandmother did, at the dime stores. and they had their own, attractions. I remember in Woolworths, there was one wall that was just filled with black velvet paintings. Now, you really had to grow up in the 60s and 70s to even understand how prevalent and these things were, because you can't even find them anymore. But back then, they were very popular, and the subject matters were just iconic. Elvis was a big feature of these paintings, and you would mostly see him in his incarnation where he had the rhinestones and the white leather jumpsuit and the sideburns and all that. But you could find some early, Elvis paintings as well, that depicted him when he was younger. It could be rock stars like Jimi Hendrix, Jim Morrison, Grateful Dead, sort of psychedelic and weed influenced, paintings. You had your animals. You had the funny paintings of like the dogs playing poker and stuff like that. And you had these scantily clad babes. Now, those did not exactly escape the notice of a young boy. Both Woolworths and Kresge's also had diners. Along the one side of the wall, there would be, a counter and booths. And working class people would go in there for coffee in the morning or a cheap lunch. And it was a way for my grandmother to extend our outing a little bit by sitting in a booth, and we'd maybe get a hot dog or French fries, maybe a little cup of ice cream, and that was always a treat. But the section of the store that we loved the most was naturally the toy section. So we wouldn't be satisfied unless we could spend at least a few minutes, strolling down the aisles or running down the aisles and checking out all the new toys. We didn't get anything like that. Those were way too expensive, your average toy, but my grandmother did indulge us, even though the budgets were tight and she was always stretching just to pay for food and basic items. She would often relent and get, especially me and George, the younger kids, she would get us a little trinket. I don't know. It could be a balsa wood airplane, the kind with the plastic propeller and the rubber bands, and you'd fly it, and it would last maybe an hour before something broke on it. There were the army men, the plastic army men with the plastic parachutes, and we'd throw them off the second story back porch at Mill Street. Oh, dart guns. Dart guns. Talk about something that my grandmother always regretted getting us. We'd get the dart gun, and it would have a set of, 4 little plastic or whatever darts. And back then they were pretty hefty, actually. So we'd shoot those. We'd inevitably lose the original darts. And guess what happened to fit in most of these dart guns? Pencils. So we, load them up with pencils and we'd shoot those, but they didn't have any ends that were, like the ends that could stick to something or be a little bit safer. And talk about poke your eye out moments. My grandmother she would be so nervous as we played with these dart guns and insisted on loading them up with pencils, but somehow we survived. So my grandmother also liked to take us to other parts of Poughkeepsie, just for the heck of it sometimes. I mean, she would take us to the post office and do her errands and stuff like that. So we'd see, kind of big places that were, I don't know, they just had a sense of history about them. But she would also take us to the community pools in the summertime. There was one called Wheaton Park that was down near the train station. And then she would take us to the Poughkeepsie train station. I knew she had a soft spot for that place. And I think the reason is because, well, she used it when she lived in Brooklyn, and she would take my mom as a child back up to Poughkeepsie to visit her parents who lived on Mill Street. But she just there was a side of her that always loved the city. She was born in Brooklyn. That's where my great-grandfather, was when he had most of his children. And so she grew up there in the city in Brooklyn. And my great-grandfather did move at the start of the Depression up to Hyde Park, tried to start a farm. That failed, but he stayed in Poughkeepsie. When my grandmother when she married in 1939, she and her husband moved back down to Brooklyn. My grandfather, Anthony, he worked as a shoemaker in a factory. And my grandmother had various jobs, and she also stayed home partly when my mom was young to care for her. But she worked in the Brooklyn Navy Yard during World War II. Whew, she was a hard worker, and she would tell me stories that she would break down and cry. It was so hot and the work was so difficult. And the idea of my grandmother being overwhelmed by some work was just, to me, almost impossible to even contemplate because she had so much energy, so much vitality. So, in any case, she loved, going to the Poughkeepsie train station and just taking us around there. There were parts we couldn't go to, though, because they were kind of fenced off and they were in obvious disrepair. And her taking us around kind of is what gave me a little bit of the idea of how things were declining a little bit in the late 60s and early 70s. Of course, back beyond our backyard, we were in the north side of Poughkeepsie, and that was the poorest section, but there was an urban renewal project going up, and so things like that were being built to try to revitalize the city, but, it was just housing for poor people, basically. And the department stores and other aspects of Main Street were beginning to decline, and there were businesses closing. Lucky Platts, there were 5 floors. We loved going on the elevator, but then one time we went to Lucky Platts and the 5th floor was no more. You couldn't get there because they shut it down. They didn't have enough merchandise to put on the shelves. Those 2 department stores eventually closed by the late 70s, early 80s. In any case, later, it was only later that I really understood what the factors were that were going on. My work as a journalist, futurist forecasting and keeping up to date with, what was going on in technology and changes in society and stuff like that. Well, it turns out 1970 was the apex, pretty much the topping point of American participation in the middle class. In 1970, about nearly 70% of Americans could count themselves as middle class by median income. Today, it's hovering in the low 50s. Now think about that. That's in spite of the rise of personal computing and the information age, which took hold in the late 70s and 80s. And you had stock market participation with things like 401ks and IRAs. You had the rise of the internet. And all of a sudden, we could communicate with each other much more efficiently and faster and beyond the World Wide Web. And you could have a website, you could do e-commerce. That was all happening in the 90s. Of course, there was the dot-com bust, but, it was temporary. And, we know just how important the internet is. And we had the rise of cell phones and then smartphones. And now you have these things in your hand that could make things, communication and information, even more efficient. You could remote work and get things done. And now we have the rise of generative AI, and now we have content that can be produced for us, and we have automation and all. I'm not even talking about medical advances. I'm not talking about robotics and all kinds of other automation. Why aren't we at 80, 90% middle class participation? It's kind of crazy to think about. The area I live in right now, Sharon, PA, it kind of reminds me of Hyde Park in Poughkeepsie in the 1970s. It's almost like these towns and these small cities, they're still going through it, Kind of crazy to think about. Okay, done with my rant. Let's go back to the story. Now I'll talk about my mom for a little bit. Now my grandmother, her happiest moments were when she could shop for food, and the only time she would ever get short-tempered was sometimes at the end of the month when, the money was the tightest and we might be out of money. And she had a little garden in back that my great-grandfather was still trying to keep up a little bit, but it used to be a big flourishing Italian garden, and he had a fig tree in the back, and he had fruit trees and peaches and all this other stuff. Well, by the late 60s, all that was mostly gone. And it was down to just having some tomatoes and cucumbers and maybe some zucchini. Well, sometimes that's what we were eating at the end of the month, along with a hunk of bread and a little olive oil and vinegar. But when the checks came in, my grandmother was in her glory. Then she would rush us up to the IGA, the independent grocer that was a few blocks above Woolworths, and boy, just shopping, just putting food in that cart and then bringing it home and being able to cook again. That's what made her happy. And of course she would get us this, she'd get me these beef pot pies I liked, and they were like maybe 10 cents. She got trays of Salisbury steaks, and God knows how much real meat was in those things, but you know, as kids we scapped them up for sure. But she was really great, of course, at all the traditional Italian and Sicilian dishes. She made fantastic fish dishes, especially around Christmas time, scungili and, you know, the squid and this soup, bacala, dried salted cod, and she made that with olives and onions and just a delicious broth. She could make chicken cacciatore and the baked ziti and the lasagna and, you know, of course, the regular pasta sauce with all kinds of different meat and neck bones and pig's feet, and just incredible. Now, my mom, different completely. She had her own unique style as a cook and her own ways of stretching the budget, so to speak. It's kind of funny because my mom was born in 1941, along with all those iconic figures of the 60s, right around that same time period. You know, Bob Dylan or Paul McCartney, John Lennon, or Jim Morrison, or Grace Slick, Janis Joplin, all the rest. My mom's born right in that time period, and she had to do things her own way. She renamed herself at a certain point. She changed her name from Joan to Johanna, and she needed a spice rack that just had all these exotic spices. God knows how she acquired them because, you know, it cost money, and she was just trying to put food on the table a lot of the time. But she used those spices to good advantage to kind of spice up like would otherwise be very bland meals, you know. My grandmother only used a few spices. She used oregano, a bay leaf. She put that in the Sunday sauce. You know, a little bit of dried basil. That was about it. You know, salt and pepper. But my mom, like I said, she had all these different spices. Sometimes it worked really great for these unique dishes that she created that were her own unique style. And then sometimes she would go overboard, and I could eat anything. She put it in front of me. I was just happy to have food. But sometimes my brother George and my older sister, they could not stomach it. And it wasn't that they were particularly finicky, especially George. It was just like almost his body would have an allergic reaction to some of these concoctions of my mom's. I'll mention one dish in particular. My mom came up with this thing, basically scrambled eggs, and then she'd throw a can of peas, or maybe sometimes frozen peas, but I think it was mostly just canned peas. Onions she'd fry up and put in there, and also just a can of anything else she had on hand. It could be mushrooms or it could be something else. Well, my brother George could not stand this dish, especially because of the peas and onions, I think. And so on those nights, George basically would not touch it. I could have more. I liked it. It was fine with me. But he would be forced to just have like a couple slices of Wonder Bread and, you know, a butter-like spread. We didn't mostly have butter at the kitchen table then. It was like these hydrogenated oil, non-butter spreads that, you know, you see the commercials, better than, you know, advertised as better than butter, basically, you know, but they were just cheaper than butter. There was one called, I don't know, crock pot or something like that. It was a huge tub you could buy cheaply. And so my mom stretched the budget in her own ways. Now, as far as indulging us, my mom was a little bit stricter and more selective than my grandmother, for sure. She got so pissed off, like with the cereal wars. You know, those were the wars that kids had among siblings for who was going to get that toy in the cereal box. You know, these cereal boxes, they were insidious the way they put these toys in there, and you choose a cereal more for the toy than for the cereal. You know, but she hated, especially if it was a full box and we tried putting our hands in the cereal to search for that toy. She would really get pissed off at us. In any case, there was a cereal that I especially loved. It was called Quisp. And it had this little character who I guess was an alien, and he had a propeller for a head, you know, on top of his head. And he could fly around, and he had a flying saucer. Of course, I love sci-fi, and I was a comic book nerd, so Quisp appealed to me for that reason. Kind of tasted like Captain Crunch. Well, on the box I saw one time that they had this thing you could send away for. A Quisp flying saucer with a remote control. Well, I just wanted this thing so badly. I started saving up money for it, and it was probably only $4 or $5, but I I didn't even have enough. I couldn't save up enough, but I begged my mom. I said, Mom, could I please get this? Can you help me out? Can you send it away for me? And she finally said, yeah, okay, give me the money. So she took the money from me, and she said she sent for it. So I waited. I waited a week. I waited 2 weeks. I waited a month. Then I was nagging at her, Mom, did you send it? What happened? She's like, I sent it. I don't know what happened. I don't. It didn't come. Well, it never came. It's kind of funny because years after that, for years, for the rest of her life, I would occasionally berate her and say, Ma, tell me the truth. Did you really send away for that Quisp flying saucer? And you know what? I never exactly got a straight answer out of her about that. One thing she did get me, I have to give her credit for, mid-70s. Now, Stan Lee, the publisher, head of Marvel Comics, he was an entrepreneur for sure, and he was always coming out with some new wrinkle to make money. And at that time, there was a hardbound edition of something called The Origins of Marvel Comics. Wow, when I saw this thing, the artwork on the cover and just the idea that you would have all the original stories of, Spider-Man and my favorite, the Hulk and Thor and the Fantastic Four and Iron Man. And, well, I wanted this book so badly. And it was before my birthday, and I begged my mom. I said, Ma, I really want this. She saw that I love drawing. I love drawing superheroes and stuff like that. Well, I have to say that's one thing that she did get me. And got to thank her for that because, like I said, money was sometimes tight. I remember my grandmother doing an incredible thing. She would show up at our door more than once on Violet Avenue in Hyde Park. She had walked all the way from Mill Street with bags of groceries in paper bags with the twine handles at that time, like it was made of like rope, And she wouldn't take a cab because she wanted to spend the extra money on food. And so she would walk miles to get to our house, carrying those bags and having my eldest sister, Gina, in tow with her because Gina lived with her. Just incredible. And what a godsend. I mean, to see her show up at our door when we were like really, at a low point and have just those bags of groceries was incredible.